Dear viewer, you are about to board a train that does not exist on any map. A train that has no timetable, no ticket counter, and no scheduled arrival. Some say it moves through the dark spaces between guilt and redemption. Others say it is simply a ghost story told by Eastern European railway workers to explain the unexplainable. But I assure you, what follows is very, very real. If this story grips you, if it keeps you awake at 2 a.m. turning pages or scrolling screens, then do what every reasonable person does when they find something extraordinary. Share it and subscribe for more, because there are more trains like this one, more mysteries, more nights where the truth arrives like a locomotive out of the fog. Now, find your seat. The whistle has blown.
The telegram that smelled of smoke. It was the smell that Hercule Poirot noticed first. Not the smell of Bucharest, that magnificent, chaotic perfume of roasting meat and diesel and old stone and black market perfume, but something underneath it. Something older. The faint, acrid ghost of burning wood and scorched iron that no amount of autumn wind quite managed to carry away. He stood on platform 7 of Gare du Nord at 11:30 on a Tuesday evening in October 1934, holding a telegram in one gloved hand and his walking stick in the other, and he was, for perhaps the first time in 20 years of professional detection, uncertain. The telegram had arrived at his hotel that morning, slipped under his door with no sender's name and no post office stamp. It read, "Your man is on the midnight train from Bucharest, Compartment B.
He will not be there by morning if you are not. A friend." Now, Hercule Poirot did not typically respond to anonymous telegrams. He was not, as he was fond of reminding people, a man who chased shadows. He was a man who sat very still and let the shadows come to him, where he could examine them properly under good light. But the man in question, one Victor Albescu, suspected of 3 murders across 4 countries, whom Interpol had been chasing since 1929, was worth a brief compromise of principle. And so here he was. The platform was almost entirely deserted. A single porter pushed an empty trolley somewhere in the fog. A woman in a red coat read a newspaper on a bench, not looking up. A dog, thin, uncertain, the way Bucharest's street dogs always were, sat near the edge of the platform and stared at the tracks as though it knew something. The train arrived at 11:47. It should not have surprised Poirot. Trains arrive. This is their function. And yet, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck do something they had not done since a particularly unpleasant night in Cairo in 1922. Something about the way the engine emerged from the tunnel was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not the stuff of penny dreadful novels, just quietly, persistently wrong. The locomotive was older than it should have been. The paint on the carriages was a deep burgundy that looked almost black in the station lights. The destination board on the side read Terminus. Nothing else, no city, no region, just Terminus. Poirot approached the conductor, a thin man with a grey uniform and eyes that seemed to focus on a point approximately 3 feet behind Poirot's head. "This train," Poirot said, in his impeccable French-accented Romanian. "Where does it go?" The conductor smiled. It was the kind of smile that answered nothing. "To the end of the line, monsieur." "That is not," Poirot began. But the conductor had already moved on, walking the length of the platform with that particular efficiency of railwaymen who have been doing something so long they no longer think about it. The dog on the platform made a sound, not a bark, not a whine, but something in between, and then turned and walked away into the fog and did not come back. Poirot looked at the train. He looked at the telegram in his hand. He looked at the train again.
"Voyons," he murmured to himself. "The little grey cells have gotten you out of worse situations than this. Board the train, find Albescu, go back to your hotel and have the excellent breakfast you reserved for tomorrow morning." He boarded the train. Compartment B held 12 people. Poirot noticed this immediately because he had expected to find it occupied by one man, Victor Albescu, and instead found himself standing in the doorway of a compartment that was, somehow, large enough to hold a long mahogany table, 12 high-backed chairs, and 12 individuals who all looked up at him with the same expression. The careful, neutral blankness of people trying very hard not to show that they had been expecting him. This was architecturally impossible, of course. Compartment B on a standard 1934 railway car could not contain what he was currently looking at. And yet, here it was. The little grey cells, Poirot thought, will need to work overtime tonight. He stepped inside. The door slid shut behind him with the soft, decisive click of a lock turning. And the train began to move. He studied the 12 as they studied him. There was a Hungarian aristocrat, Count Miklos Feher, who held a cigarette between 2 fingers and hadn't lit it. Beside him, a German woman of perhaps 55, rigid as a military officer, who introduced herself only as Frau K. and declined to elaborate. Next to her, a young Greek engineer named Stavros Papadimitriou, who was sweating despite the cold. Then a British banker, a Polish schoolteacher, a Romanian doctor, an Austrian musician, a Czechoslovakian factory owner, a Turkish customs official, a French journalist, and a Bulgarian priest, whose hands, Poirot noted, were folded on the table in the position of a man who has not prayed in a very long time. 12 people, 12 countries, and not one of them, not a single one, would give their full name. "I am Hercule Poirot," he announced, because he had found that announcing himself tended to produce reactions that were informative. "I am a detective, I am Belgian, and I am, I confess, somewhat puzzled as to why I have found myself in this particular compartment on this particular train." The French journalist, she had red hair and the particular calm of someone who had reported on things she could not unsee, looked at him with something like pity. "We all are, Monsieur Poirot," she said. "We all are." 12 strangers and one secret. Outside the windows of Compartment B, there was nothing. Not darkness in the way that countryside at midnight is dark. Not the occasional flicker of a farmhouse light. Not the silhouette of a tree line. Not the reflective glint of a river. Simply nothing. As though the train were moving through the space between one thought and the next, through the pause between a question and an answer. Poirot had noticed this within the first 10 minutes. He had also noticed that the train was moving at a speed inconsistent with the gentle swaying and the soft clatter of wheels on tracks. He was, by temperament and profession, a man who catalogued details. And the details here were catalogued under a heading he had never used before: things that should not be. Find ourselves in unusual circumstances. I find ourselves in unusual circumstances. I suggest we proceed in an orderly fashion. I will ask questions. You will answer them. If someone lies, we will find that out. We always find that out. He paused. I have found it in my experience that the truth, however painful, is considerably less troublesome in the long run than the alternative. Silence. Then the Bulgarian priest, Father Bogdan, as he eventually offered, said quietly, "What if the truth is the most painful thing of all, Monsieur Poirot?" "Then it will still be the truth," Poirot replied. "And that, mon père, is always where we must begin." They talked eventually. Not freely, not the way people talk when they feel safe, but the way people talk when they feel that the walls are closing in and silence has become more dangerous than speech. What emerged was this. None of them had intended to board this train. The banker from London had been heading to Vienna. The German woman had been travelling to Warsaw. The Greek engineer had a ticket to Athens. Each of them had found themselves on Platform 7 of Gare du Nord at different times, in different years, under different circumstances, and each time, they had boarded a train and found themselves here. "Each time?" Poirot said sharply. "You have been on this train before?" The Turkish customs official, a heavy man with a magnificent moustache that Poirot might, under other circumstances, have admired, cleared his throat. "This is my 3rd time," he said. He looked at his hands. "I keep hoping I will finally be able to do what is required, and I keep—" He stopped. "And you keep failing," the French journalist supplied. Not cruelly, just accurately. The Turkish man nodded. "What is required?" Poirot asked. Another silence. Longer this time. The train continued its impossible journey through impossible darkness. It was the British banker, a pale, elegant man named only Edward, who wore his guilt the way some men wear fine suits, with great care and at considerable expense, who finally spoke. "You must understand, Monsieur Poirot, that none of us here are good people." "I have rarely encountered entirely good people," Poirot said pleasantly. "Please continue." Edward looked around the table, at the Count, who was still holding his unlit cigarette,
At the priest, whose hands had finally unfolded. At the Polish schoolteacher, who was looking at the table with the intensity of someone reading something written in the wood. In 1924, Edward said, there was a train, the Orient Star, a luxury express running between Constantinople and Paris. The room changed. That is the only way to describe it. The temperature didn't drop, the lights didn't flicker, but something shifted in the air of Compartment B. Some pressure, some weight, as though the darkness outside had pressed itself against the windows to listen. 311 people were on board, Edward continued. 300 of them died. He placed both palms flat on the mahogany table.
And every single person in this compartment is the reason why." The story came out in pieces after that, fragments offered by different voices, like a mosaic being assembled by reluctant hands. Stavros, the Greek engineer, had designed the braking system for that stretch of track. He had known there was a flaw. He had reported it to his superiors and been told the cost of fixing it was too high, and he had, God help him he had, let it go. The Austrian factory owner, Herr Brenner, eventually, had supplied the brakes themselves. Faulty materials, purchased at a discount, signed off on with a pen stroke that had taken him less than 3 seconds and had killed 300 people. The signal operator, a Romanian man named Gheorghe, who sat very still and stared at his coffee cup, had fallen asleep at his post. He had been awake for 36 hours. He had begged for a replacement. His supervisor had refused. He had fallen asleep anyway because he was human and his signal had shown green when it should have shown red. And so on. Around the table, each person, each failure, each small, human, catastrophic choice. The Polish schoolteacher, Miss Agnieszka, had been a railway inspector in 1924. She had filed a safety report on that exact line 6 months before the accident. The report had been dismissed. She had not appealed it. She had moved on to other work. She had told herself it was not her responsibility. The French journalist Madeleine had known. She had a source inside the railway company who had told her about the brake problems, the suppressed reports, the cost-cutting.
She had been 26 years old and ambitious, and she had calculated that exposing a railway scandal was worth less to her career than the story she was currently pursuing. A political corruption piece she'd thought would make her famous. She had been wrong about that too. The political story had come to nothing, and 300 people had died on a train she could have stopped. Poirot listened to all of it without interrupting. When it was over, when the last voice had fallen silent, he sat for a long moment with his hands folded and his grey eyes moving slowly around the table, cataloguing, as was his habit, the texture of each person's guilt. There was one thing he had noticed. There were 12 seats at the table and 12 people, including himself, and Victor Albescu, the man he had come to find, was not among them.
He had never been on this train at all. Someone sent me here deliberately, Poirot thought. The question is why. He did not yet know the answer, but then, at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, they heard the scream. The dead man who was never born. The scream came from Compartment B itself, which was impossible because they were all sitting in Compartment B, all 12 of them, at the same table. And yet, Poirot was on his feet before the sound had fully died. Old habit. 20 years of crime scenes had given his legs a kind of independent intelligence. They moved toward danger while his brain was still cataloguing the sound. The scream had been high, brief and female, and it had come from the far end of the compartment, where, now that he looked, there was a door he had not previously noticed. He walked to it. The others followed. He could feel them behind him. 12 people pressing forward with the particular urgency of those who suspect they already know what they are about to see and are going nevertheless. He opened the door. The room beyond was small, a sleeping berth. Narrow bed, blue curtains, a single lamp casting amber light, and on the bed, dressed in a black coat that was slightly too large for him, lay an elderly man. He was dead, quite thoroughly, unmistakably dead. The stillness of him had that particular quality that Poirot had learned to recognize in his first year as a detective in Brussels and had never been able to forget. Not sleeping, not unconscious, gone. On his chest, folded with careful precision, was a letter. Poirot picked it up with gloved fingers. He always carried gloves, a habit his colleagues had once mocked and had long since stopped mocking, and read it aloud. I am the one you have all been looking for, the judge, the witness, the record. I have watched each of you for 10 years, 10 years of watching you live your comfortable lives while 300 names gathered dust on a memorial no one visits. Tonight I return to you in this form. My work is not yet finished. The reckoning is not yet complete. One of you will be next. The train does not stop until all accounts are settled. V. He folded the letter. He looked at the dead man. He looked at the 12 faces in the doorway. 12 faces at various stages of carefully maintained composure. Does anyone, he said in his most conversational tone, recognize this man? No one spoke, and then Madeleine, the French journalist, made a broken sound, not quite a word, not quite a sob, and said, "Give me a moment." She pushed past the others and went back to the compartment. When she returned, she was carrying a photograph. She placed it on the bed, next to the dead man's right hand. The photograph was old, sepia-toned, cracked along one edge, and it showed, quite clearly, with the merciless fidelity of old cameras, a group of people standing in front of a train station. Poirot recognized the station, Gare du Nord, Bucharest. He recognized 11 of the 12 people in the compartment standing in the photograph. And standing in the center of the group, younger by a decade but unmistakable, was the dead man. The photograph was dated September 14th, 1924, 6 weeks before the Orient Star disaster. "Where did you get this?" Poirot asked. "Jim, it was in my compartment," Madeleine said. "On my pillow. When I boarded the train tonight, before I found the others." She looked around. "I assumed one of you had put it there." One by one, slowly, the others reached into pockets, pulled from bags, extracted from wallets, photographs. All the same, all dated 1924. All showing this same group in front of this same station, 12 people who, in 1924, had never met and had no reason to stand together for a photograph. And in the center of each photograph, the same elderly man who now lay dead before them. "But this is impossible," Stavros said. He was shaking slightly, which Poirot understood. "We were not all in Bucharest in 1924. I was in Athens. Frau K. was in Munich. I know this because you were not yet connected," Poirot said slowly.
An idea was forming in the back of his mind. The small grey cells beginning their particular dance, assembling fragments into patterns, not to each other, not yet. He picked up the photograph, studied it, turned it over. On the back of each photograph, he checked, moving around the room, was written a single word, different on each. Coward, greedy, negligent, ambitious, complicit, silent, indifferent, comfortable, obedient, afraid, convenient, absent. He turned over his own photograph, the one Madeleine handed him, the one that had been found on his pillow, though he had not boarded the train early enough to have a pillow. His word was absent. Hercule Poirot stood very still. Absent, he thought. I was absent. And 300 people died. The train continued into the dark. The architecture of Guild Poirot spent the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning doing what he did best, thinking. He sat in the far corner of Compartment B, slightly apart from the others, who had fractured into smaller groups, seeking the cold comfort of proximity. And he thought with the methodical ferocity of a watchmaker taking apart a clock that has stopped. The facts as he had them. 1. This train existed outside normal geography. The darkness outside was not the darkness of the Romanian countryside. It was something else. A darkness with weight, with intention. He had pressed his hand to the window glass and felt nothing. Not cold, not vibration. Just the smooth certainty of a boundary. 2. The dead man could not have boarded this train. Poirot had stood on the platform and watched every passenger board.
He had counted them, as was his habit. 11 plus himself, 12. There had been no elderly man in a black coat. No one had smuggled a body onto a train, a body that was, moreover, perfectly arranged on a bed in a room that had not existed 40 minutes earlier. 3. The photographs were impossible, and yet they were here. And someone had known that Poirot would be on this train. The telegram? The anonymous friend? This had been arranged. 4. The dead man's letter. I am the one you have all been looking for. Not a threat, not precisely a threat, more like an announcement. A stage manager stepping out from behind the curtain to introduce the play. V. The letter had been signed. Victor? No, something larger than one man. He thought about what Edward had said. The train never stops until all accounts are settled. Whenever someone denies, a passenger disappears. He thought about the word on his photograph, absent. In 1924, he had been in Brussels. He had read about the Orient Star disaster in the newspaper, 300 dead, mechanical failure, Eastern European railway negligence, and he had thought, how terrible. And then he had turned the page. He had been 34 years old, already an established detective, already with a reputation that stretched across Belgium and into France. He had read about 300 deaths and thought how terrible and turned the page. What had he been working on in October 1924? He remembered. A jewel theft, a wealthy Flemish family, not one life at stake, not one. He had had the skill, the connections, the intelligence to investigate the Orient Star disaster. He could have pulled on threads. Could have found the faulty brakes, the suppressed reports, the negligent inspectors. Could have, at minimum, ensured that someone was held responsible. He had not even considered it. Because it was not my case, he thought. Because no one hired me. Because I told myself it was not my affair. He felt something uncomfortable shift in his chest. Poirot was not accustomed to guilt. He was accustomed to being the instrument through which others faced their guilt. He was accustomed to standing at the end of a case and saying, "This is what happened and this is who is responsible." He had never stood at the end of a case and said, "I am responsible." At 4:15 a.m., the Count's cigarette, the one he had been holding unlit since Poirot boarded, fell from his fingers. Poirot looked up. The Count was gone. His chair was empty. His coat was folded over the back of it. His cigarette lay on the floor. There were 10 other people in the room, and every one of them had seen it happen, and not one of them had seen how. He had simply ceased to be there. Miss Agnieszka, the Polish schoolteacher, made a soft sound and pressed both hands over her mouth. "He denied," Madeleine said. Her voice was very flat. She had gone beyond the register of shock into something quieter and colder. "At dinner, I heard him. He said the accident wasn't his fault, that he had been following orders, that he couldn't have known—" "And now he is gone," Father Bogdan said. He was not, Poirot noted, looking at the empty chair. He was looking at his own hands, as though he were seeing something written on them that only he could read. "What happens to them?" Stavros asked. "In the real world, a count named Miklos in the real world, a count named Miklos Feher, had just had a fatal accident." The judge of lost things. By 5 o'clock in the morning, they had lost 3 more. Herr Brenner,
The Austrian factory owner disappeared between one blink and the next while insisting that the brake materials had met the specifications provided to him, that he could not be blamed for specifications he had not written. He was mid-sentence when he went. The end of his sentence hung in the air of Compartment B like a question without an answer. The Turkish customs official, whose name turned out to be Mehmet, vanished after a long, agonized silence during which he had tried, twice, to say something that sounded like the beginning of an admission, and then both times retreated to a careful explanation of why his role had been peripheral, administrative, barely relevant. Gheorghe, the Romanian signal operator, lasted the longest of the three. He sat in his chair for nearly an hour after Brenner disappeared, and in that hour his face underwent a journey that Poirot, who had watched many faces, found extraordinarily painful to observe. Hope and shame and defiance and grief cycling through him like weather. Finally, he said, "I fell asleep. People died because I fell asleep. I know this. I have known it for 10 years. He looked at his coffee cup. But I was so tired. I was so very tired. And they would not give me relief. So is it really... He was gone before he finished. 8 remained. Poirot stood up.
"I require," he said, "to speak to whoever is conducting this train." "You can't," Madeleine began. "I intend to try," Poirot said. He straightened his jacket. He touched the sides of his moustache. These small rituals of grooming had always helped him think, and he needed to think very clearly right now. He walked to the door of Compartment B. He opened it. Beyond it was not the corridor he had entered through. It was a single small room, almost a cabin, and it contained only an armchair and, sitting in it, a man. The man looked like the dead man from the sleeping berth, younger, or rather not quite alive, not quite dead. As though the concept of age did not apply to him, his eyes were dark and very calm. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "I have been expecting you to come here." "I suspected as much," Poirot said. He sat, because there was a second chair that had not been there a moment ago. "I have several questions." "I know." "Good." Poirot folded his hands. "First, you are not a man." "No." "You are, what, a mechanism, a principle? Some metaphysical construct designed to deliver justice to those who have evaded it." The entity that was not a man considered this. "I am what guilt looks like," it said, "when it has been accumulating for 10 years with nowhere to go." "Poetic," Poirot said dryly. "Less useful than I had hoped. Let me try again. The train, this limbo, this space, it was created by the collective weight of 12 guilty consciences. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And your role is to shepherd them to acknowledgement, to ensure that each person faces what they have done?" "Yes." "And those who refuse are removed." "They return to the world," the entity said, briefly, "and then the weight of what they refuse to face becomes physical. It always does, eventually." Poirot nodded. This he had already deduced. "And myself?" A silence. The entity looked at him with those dark, calm eyes. "You were the one who could have found the truth," it said. "You were the one with the skill and the reach and the reputation. If you had investigated the Orient Star disaster, if you had pulled the threads, the engineers who signed fraudulent reports would have been exposed. The company would have faced consequences. Different brakes would have been mandated. The accident might not have happened at all," Poirot said quietly. "Or if it had, it would have been the last one. Instead, the same company, the same brakes, the same negligence continued for 3 more years on other lines." Poirot absorbed this. "How many others?" he asked. 67, the entity said. "On other trains, in other accidents, that no one investigated." Hercule Poirot sat very still. He thought of all the cases he had taken between 1924 and 1934. The titled clients, the wealthy clients, the interesting puzzles. He thought of how he had always told himself he was in the service of justice, that his particular application of the little grey cells was a gift, something to be used where it was needed most. Where it was needed most, he thought, or where it was most interesting, where it was most profitable, where the client was most grateful, most refined, most capable of providing a comfortable fee. He had never, not once in 10 years, investigated a tragedy that had no individual client, a crime that had no one rich or connected enough to hire him. 67 people, he thought, on other trains. I see, he said. Yes, the entity said. I believe you do. What 8 people have in common? He returned to compartment B. 8 faces turned toward him. In his absence, perhaps 20 minutes, no one else had disappeared. They were sitting very close together now, the 8 of them, the way people cluster during a storm. Madeleine looked at him. What is it? A mechanism of justice, Poirot said, sitting back at his place at the head of the table. Neither magical nor supernatural, whatever it may appear. It is guilt made manifest. The collective weight of 8, now 8, it was 12. Guilty consciences has created this space, and it will maintain this space until those consciences either acknowledge their guilt or are, he paused, removed. Removed, Stavros repeated. He looked slightly ill. Tell me, Poirot said, of the 3 who left tonight, Brenner, Mehmet, George, did any of them, in the end, come close? George, Madeleine said immediately. Father Bogdan nodded. Yes, I thought so. He was so very close. If he had taken one more breath, if he had simply completed his thought, Poirot shook his head. The word he needed was yes, not an explanation, not a context, simply yes, I did this. It is mine. That sounds very simple, said the British banker Edward. It is the hardest thing in the world, Poirot replied. I speak from present experience. He looked around the table. The 8 people, 8 different textures of guilt, and Hercule Poirot among them, which was not something he had anticipated when he dressed for dinner in Bucharest yesterday evening. He made a decision. He had been trained all his professional life to find the answers, to be the one at the end who stood up and explained and pointed. It had been his role, his identity, his entire sense of himself. Hercule Poirot did not confess. Hercule Poirot received confessions, but the little grey cells were telling him something different tonight. They were telling him that the architecture of this moment required something he had never given anyone before. First, though, he needed the others. I'm going to tell you something, he said, and I am going to ask each of you to listen carefully. Well, because what I am about to say is both a strategy and an act of cowardice, and I want you to understand the difference. 8 pairs of eyes. The mechanism of this train requires acknowledgement, pure acknowledgement, not explanation, not context, not the particular human instinct to justify oneself before confessing. Those who have tried justification have, you have seen what happens. He paused. What is required is much smaller and much larger than an explanation. It is simply the truth spoken out loud. I did this, it happened. There is no version of events in which I did not do this. Silence. Then Edward, the British banker, laughed. Not a happy laugh. The laugh of a man who has been carrying something heavy for so long that being asked to put it down feels obscene. You make it sound easy, he said. It is not easy, Poirot said. I know this because I am about to do it myself. He placed his hands flat on the table, palms down, the way Edward had earlier. And I am, I confess, more frightened than I have been in a very long time. 11 confessions and a mirror. It took 4 hours. 4 hours of stops and starts, of voices breaking and recovering, of silences so complete that Poirot could hear his own heartbeat. 4 hours of 8 people dismantling the careful architecture of self-justification that they had spent 10 years constructing. Edward the banker spoke first. Once Poirot told him he would go first himself and needed a moment to prepare. The banker had financed the railway company. He had known, his lawyers had told him explicitly, in a letter he had not destroyed and had not acted on, that the company was cutting corners on safety. He had financed them anyway, because the returns were excellent and the risk was someone else's problem. I thought, Edward said after a very long time, that I was not the one making the decision, that I was simply adjacent to it, providing capital, a financial instrument, not a person who chose. His voice broke slightly. But of course I chose. I signed the papers. I cashed the dividends. 300 people. He looked at his hands. It was me. It was mine. I did this. The room shifted. A subtle thing, the same pressure change that Poirot had felt when Edward first mentioned the Orient Star. But different in direction, as though something that had been pulling inward began, infinitesimally, to release. Edward was still there. Madeleine went next. She was precise,
as journalists are. She listed the facts of what she had known and when she had known it and what she had chosen to do instead, with the unflinching accuracy of someone writing a correction for their own obituary. When she was finished, she looked at the table and did not speak for a moment. Then she said, "I told myself for 10 years that I was 26 and ambitious and that I didn't know how bad it would be. But I knew enough. I always knew enough. I chose my story over their lives. That is what happened." Still there, Miss Agnieszka, the Polish inspector, required 2 attempts. The first time she got almost to the end and inserted a single caveat, "But my report was dismissed. I had done my part." And the light in the compartment flickered, and she felt, she said later, as though the floor had moved. She stopped, breathed. It was not someone else's. It was mine. And I moved on. I told myself it was someone else's responsibility to push further. It was not someone else's. It was mine. And I chose comfort over those 300 people. And so on, and so on. Stavros, the Austrian doctor, whose contribution had been signing off as the railway's company physician on fatigue assessments for workers that he had known were falsified. Father Bogdan, whose role was the strangest of all. He had been a city official in 1922, 2 years before the accident, who had rejected a proposal to fund an independent railway safety board because he had disliked the man who proposed it. A personal grudge. 72 words of administrative denial, 300 people. He wept when he said it. He was not a man who wept easily. Poirot could see that. The weeping was not performance. It was the sound of something that had been locked in a room for 10 years being, finally, let out. The French musician, Armand, who had been a composer hired to score an advertising film for the railway company in 1923, who had seen the faulty equipment on set and said nothing because he feared losing the commission, spoke briefly and simply and with enormous dignity. And finally, after 7 confessions, after the compartment had taken on a quality of lightness that should not have been physically possible, as though the darkness outside the windows had thinned, Poirot looked at the British banker's empty chair. Edward was not there. For a moment his heart lurched. Then he saw Edward standing by the window, looking at the darkness, which was... "Go?" Edward asked. "When it's over." "Go?" Edward asked. "When it's over." "Back," Poirot said. "That has always been the offer. Back to your lives. Different, I imagine. But back." Edward nodded slowly. He did not look like a man who was sure whether he deserved to go back. That uncertainty, Poirot thought, was probably the most appropriate thing he had felt in 10 years. 7 people remained, 7 confessions delivered, and Poirot. They all looked at him. "Ah," he said. "Yes, my turn." He was quiet for a moment. That was longer than most moments. Then Hercule Poirot, celebrated detective, celebrated brain, celebrated ego, who had never in 30 years of professional life been anything other than the cleverest person in the room, said the following: "I was not there. I did not do what those of you at this table did. I did not sign papers. I did not falsify assessments. I did not accept money for silence. In that sense I am perhaps different from you." He paused. "But I had something none of you had. I had the ability to find out.
I had the skill, the network, the reputation, and the resources to investigate the Orient Star disaster from Brussels and to have had answers within 3 months. I know this because I am good at what I do. I know it the way a surgeon knows they could have performed an operation. He looked at his folded hands. I read about it in the newspaper, 300 dead, and I thought, how terrible. And I turned the page. The compartment was very quiet. I told myself I only take cases I am hired for, that I cannot chase every tragedy, that I have my methods, my clients, my particular domain of expertise. He felt his throat tighten in a way that was unfamiliar and not entirely welcome. And all of this was true, and none of it was sufficient. Because the truth, the honest truth that I have spent 10 years not looking at directly, is that the Orient Star was not interesting enough. There was no rich widow to hire me, no aristocratic family with secrets, no gem worth a fortune. There was only 300 dead railway passengers and a story that would have been difficult and unrewarding and would not have enhanced my reputation in the least. He stopped. He looked at the window where the sky was unmistakably lightening now. I was absent, he said, not because I could not have been there, because I chose not to be, because other things were more important to me than those 300 people, and I did not even have the honesty to admit that to myself. He breathed. That is mine. That is what I carry, and I carry it now. I carry it consciously and without mitigation. The train made a sound, not a screech, not a bang. A sound like an exhalation, like a building settling, like a held breath finally released. The windows filled slowly with light, not dawn from outside, but something warmer than dawn, the particular gold of a specific beautiful morning that felt like something earned. The train began to slow. The conductor, the station they pulled into, was unlike any station Poirot had seen. It was small, whitewashed walls, a single platform. No signs except one word above the main entrance: Partenza, Italian, departure, or beginning. The 8 of them stood on the platform in the thin gold light and looked at each other with the particular discomfort of people who have shared something enormous and must now decide what to do with ordinary life afterward. "What now?" Miss Agnieszka asked. She looked, Poirot thought, younger than she had at midnight, or perhaps not younger, just lighter. "There will be a train," Poirot said. He had understood this in the final minutes of the journey. "Another train, a different one that goes somewhere on a map. You will each go home, and you will," he considered his words, "you will live with what you know. I cannot promise you it will be comfortable. It will not, but it will be real, which is, I have found,
preferable to the alternative." Edward extended his hand. Poirot shook it. One by one they said their goodbyes. Not warmly, they were not friends, could not be friends, would in all likelihood never see each other again, and probably did not want to. But with a kind of grave respect, the handshake of people who have survived the same storm. Father Bogdan went last. He held Poirot's hand with both of his and looked at him for a long moment. "Will you go home too?" he asked. Poirot did not answer immediately. The entity that was not a man was standing at the end of the platform. He looked in the morning light less like a dead man and more like a question. "There is an offer," Poirot said carefully, "being made to me." Father Bogdan followed his gaze. "What kind of offer?" "Someone must conduct the next train," Poirot said. "Is someone who understands guilt from both directions, who has been the finger that points and the hand that failed." He watched the entity, which watched him back with its dark, calm eyes. "Someone who is, perhaps, ideally suited to guide others through this particular journey." Father Bogdan was quiet. Then, "And the alternative?" "I go home. I continue my work. The little grey cells, the wealthy clients, the interesting cases." He paused. "And somewhere else, on other trains, other accidents, other 300 people. And no one to make sure the weight of it goes somewhere. No one to ensure that guilt becomes acknowledgement instead of simply destruction."
The priest looked at him for a long time. "You have already decided," he said. Poirot smiled, a small, precise smile. "I have, mon ami. But it is considered polite to pretend one deliberates." They left him there. He watched them board the other train, the ordinary one, with its ordinary destination board showing real cities and real times, and he watched it leave, and then he was alone on the platform with the entity that was not a man. "You understand what you are choosing," the entity said. "I understand that I will be unavailable," Poirot said. He touched the points of his moustache, a last old habit, a last small vanity. "To the world I know, to the cases I would have taken, to the clients who would have hired me and the puzzles I would have solved. Yes, and the work here, guiding others through this particular accounting, this will be my case from now on. Until someone else is ready to take it." Poirot nodded. He thought briefly of Hastings.
As of Miss Lemon. Of the comfortable flat and the tisanes and the ordered routine that was, he saw now, also a kind of comfortable trap. A life so carefully arranged that it had very little room in it for the uncomfortable and unrewarding truth. "I will miss the tisanes," he said. The entity said nothing, but something in its dark eyes looked almost like sympathy. Hercule Poirot walked to the head of the platform. The new train was forming in the station, assembling itself car by car out of something that was not quite material and not quite metaphor, the way all the most necessary things do. He straightened his jacket. He checked his moustache in the reflection of the window glass. A conductor's cap appeared in his hands. He looked at it. "Put it on." The first passengers were already appearing on the platform, 12 of them. As there always were, from different countries and different decades and different varieties of the same fundamental human failure, the choice of comfort over consequence, of self over others, of turning the page. He looked at them. He felt no judgment. This surprised him a little. He had spent 30 years being very good at judging. What he felt instead was something older and quieter. Recognition. The recognition of a man who has made the same mistake in his own particular way, and who has finally been given something useful to do with it. "Mesdames et messieurs," Hercule Poirot said in his most precise and pleasant voice, "welcome aboard. I am your conductor for this journey. I ask only that you make yourselves comfortable, and that you do not be alarmed by what you find." He paused. "We will be travelling some distance. But I assure you, the destination is worth it." The train began to move. On platform 7 of Gare du Nord, Bucharest, the newspaper the next morning carried a small item on page 9. Belgian detective Hercule Poirot, who had been visiting Romania in connection with the Albescu case, appears to have departed the city unexpectedly. Colleagues in London report they have received no communication from him. Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard reached for comment, said only that Poirot had a habit of appearing precisely when needed and that he had no doubt the man was fine wherever he was. He was exactly where he needed to be. The end. There is one thing I have learned in 30 years of watching guilty people. The truth, once faced, becomes lighter. It is only the truth that is being carried in secret that grows heavier with every step. Hercule Poirot, Final Journal Entry, October 1934.